I will begin with something simple. A room, a table, a lute, a bottle of wine that is already more memory than drink. Outside, the night presses against the shutters of the inn, and the road hums softly in the distance. Inside, there is only the quiet scrape of my quill, and the small courage that comes when the world is finally too tired to listen. It is a good hour to speak of a witcher. You know his name. The ballads have carried it further than any horse could ride. Geralt of Rivia, the White Wolf, the Butcher of Blaviken. To some he is a hero, to others a walking curse, and to a few souls he is simply a man who knocks on a door when things start dying in the dark. To me, he is all of these things, and none of them. When I first met him, I did not realize that my life was being pushed onto a new page. I saw a tall man in a worn coat, hair the color of winter straw, eyes that had watched many sunrises without calling any of them beautiful. He moved through the common room as if the crowd were a river flowing around a rock. He walked untouched. Anyone with sense looked away. A witcher in a doorway is a reminder that the world is not as safe as we pretend. I had never been overly burdened with sense. I am a bard, and curiosity has always spoken louder to me than caution. I had heard the stories. A man who faced Striga and Wraith, a mutant who could see in the dark and feel danger in the hairs on his arms. I wanted to know if the truth was as interesting as the rumors already forming into rhymes in my head. So I watched him. He did not boast. He did not drink more than he needed. He did not flirt with the serving girl whose smile had toppled tougher men than I will ever admit. He sat by the wall, back to the corner, eyes on the door and the window in turn. When a loud, red-faced fellow decided to test his courage, Geralt ended it with a single glance and half a sentence that cut cleaner than any blade. No fight, no overturned tables, only a heavy pause and a muttered apology. In that quiet victory, I understood something. Monsters are easy to sing about. They have claws, teeth, and a convenient habit of roaring at the right moment. People are harder. Their fears whisper instead of scream. Their hatred wears reasonable clothes. That night, I realized that Geralt did not live in a world of simple monsters and simple heroes. He walked along the thin line where one became the other. In the end, I approached him. I would not be Dandelion if I had simply watched from a distance and gone to bed like a sensible man. I offered him a song, which he declined. I offered him a drink, which he accepted with a brief nod. We spoke little. He seemed to prefer silence, and I had already used up most of my courage crossing the room. Yet in that silence I felt something I could not name. It was not friendship. That would come later. It was simply the feeling that this man was a story, and that my life as a bard would be poorer if I let it pass me by. Years later, in the temple of Melitele, I thought back to that first night. The same man lay pale and still on a bed that smelled of herbs and stone. Yennefer moved around him with steady hands, acolytes hurried with bowls and bandages, and I, the great Dandelion, could barely hold my lute. The legendary witcher lay unmoving, and there was nothing in my art that could help him. No verse, no melody, no clever line. It is strange how we measure courage. People cheer when a monster falls, when steel rings, and danger is loud and obvious. They rarely cheer for the night after, when a witcher stares at the ceiling of a cheap room listening to his own heartbeat and wondering whether the coin he earned can really pay for what he has just done. I shared many such nights with Geralt. Sometimes he would speak a little, more often he would say nothing at all. Was it worth it? Did anyone truly understand? Could the world have been different if someone, somewhere, had chosen another path? We never know. We only see the road we walk, not the roads we refuse. And we still wonder whether all his choices ever led him closer to peace, or only deeper into legend. That is why I write this now, not as another ballad full of shining heroics and easy rhymes, but as a quiet, honest look at the man behind the medallion. You already know the legends. You have heard about Blaviken, though each tavern tells it differently. You may have listened to my songs about princesses cursed into monstrous forms and kings who pay in gold and remorse. What you have not heard is how it felt to stand beside him, not with a sword, but with a song, watching him fight battles that left no visible wounds, yet hollowed him out all the same. Life with Geralt was not only made of shadows and sharp edges. There were moments of ridiculous comedy. A cow once kicked over my instrument case in the middle of a courtly serenade. A spoiled noble failed to recognize the witcher he had summoned because Geralt did not fit his idea of a hero. These foolish episodes are bright threads in a darker tapestry. They remind me that even in a world of curses and prophecies, people still quarrel over bad wine and flirt badly under the wrong window. Tonight, as the candle burns low and the ink dries on this first page, I invite you to walk with me through those memories. Not as an audience in a crowded hall, but as quiet companions at the next table, listening to a story that perhaps should have been told long ago. If you are willing, I will show you the white wolf as I saw him. Not the statue carved by legend, but the man who sat in the corner of a common room, eyes on the door, as if listening for a future that was already on its way. The temple of Melitele smelled of stone, candle smoke, and crushed herbs. By the time I arrived there with Geralt, my head was still full of clever lines about our latest misadventure, but they scattered like frightened birds the moment I saw him laid out on the narrow bed beneath the goddess's calm, unhelpful gaze. He looked smaller without his swords. The wolf medallion rested against his chest, dull with sweat and dust, but his hands were loose at his sides, not coiled and ready as they usually were, even in sleep. Yennefer stood over him with her sleeves rolled up, expression set in that particular blend of irritation and concern that she reserved for fools, stubborn patients, and the gods themselves. "Your witcher," she said, as if I had commissioned him from a catalogue. "He courts death as if it were some noble lady." I replied that Geralt was not mine, and that death, judging by his condition, had been a little too interested this time. The abbess's answering look could have cured several lesser ailments on the spot. Then she turned back to her bowls and phials, grinding some bitter-smelling paste with brisk, decisive movements. The temple went on with its disciplined life around us. Acolytes passed with water, linen, and armfuls of dried plants. Somewhere deeper inside, a bell chimed, slicing the afternoon into careful pieces. Melitele watched from her niche, stone eyes equally indifferent to a witcher's wounds and a bard's anxiety. I kept my lute closed. It seemed wrong to let music spill into the room when the man who had dragged me out of so many dangers lay there, perhaps beyond the reach of any song, Helplessness has never suited me. In most taverns I can drown any unease under chatter or songs, but in that room every word felt wrong. I had watched Geralt face things from whispered nightmares and walk back into daylight as if danger were only weather. Some foolish corner of my mind decided he could not truly fall. Seeing him pale against the linen showed me how childish that belief had been. He groaned once, a faint rumour of sound. The medallion twitched, as if registering some distant tremor of magic, then lay still again. Yennefer bent closer, her hands moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who has argued with too many desperate people to bother with dramatics. I watched her and thought, not for the first time, that she served her goddess the way Geralt served his contracts, complaining loudly, but never stepping aside when needed. To villagers, a witcher's work costs a pouch of coins and a few anxious nights behind bolted doors. For kings, it is an item on a ledger, squeezed between feasts and hunts. On Geralt, the price showed in quieter places, the stiffness of his shoulders at dawn, the way his eyes checked every exit, the rare softness in his voice when he spoke to someone who had not yet learned what the world could take from them. We like to pretend that those who walk into danger are made of something harder than we are. It is comforting to think courage is a separate species, that a witcher's heart beats to some steadier rhythm untouched by ordinary fear. Yet I had heard Geralt question his choices in the late hours when the fire burned low, had seen him look at the aftermath of a successful contract with anything but triumph. A creature of pure reflex would not do that, and a monster would not care. In the temple, these contradictions were impossible to ignore. Yennefer scolded him even as she tended his hurts, muttering about recklessness and idiocy and the stupidity of men who thought themselves expendable. The novices watched from doorways, whispering behind their hands. To them he was the creature out of storybooks, suddenly and inconveniently real, bleeding on their sheets and disturbing their ordered piety. At one point, Yennefer shoved me into the corridor, declaring that my tragic sighing was lowering the temple's standards. I leaned against the cool stone and tried to think of something wise or pious to say. Found nothing. Instead, my mind wandered to all the unremarkable rooms where we had waited for dawn together. Smoky taverns, sagging inn beds, ship cabins that creaked with every wave. In those places, his mere presence had made uncertainty bearable. Without it, the corridor felt much longer than its few paces. If you have ever sat outside a hospital ward counting tiles on the floor just to stay calm, you know a little of what I felt. The building, the gods, the clothes may change, but the flavour of waiting does not. Eventually, Yennefer emerged, wiping her hands on a stained cloth. She announced that Geralt was obstinate enough to live, that my sighing was of no medical value whatsoever, and that if I wished to be useful, I could carry water instead of decorating her doorway. Beneath the dryness of her words, I heard relief, and suddenly the corridor seemed shorter, the stones under my feet less heavy. That night, I sat by his bed while the temple settled into its slower rhythm. The candlelight carved hollows under his cheekbones. Once or twice he muttered something, a name or a half-formed protest, and I answered anyway in a whisper he could not possibly hear. At last I opened the lute case and played a simple melody, little more than a line of notes circling back on itself, a quiet way of saying, "You are still here, and so am I. Looking back, that night did not change who Geralt was. He woke, he healed badly, he argued with Yennefer, he went out again to meet new monsters, new quarrels with kings, new collisions with destiny. What changed was the way I told his story, at least inside my own head. From then on, every brave deed came with the memory of that still figure on the temple bed. Every boast I allowed myself about travelling with the White Wolf carried a quiet awareness of how close I had come to losing him. We like to believe that the strong will always remain strong, that those who protect us are somehow spared the fragility we fear in ourselves. But we still wonder whether it is fair to lean so heavily on those we quietly expect never to fall, and what kind of loyalty we owe them once we know just how breakable they truly are. Before Geralt became a fixed point in my life, he was a rumour I chased from town to town. It began with a fragment of a song in the wrong key, sung by a drunk in a smoky inn, a white-haired man with cat's eyes who walked into a village where every door was barred and walked out with blood on his coat and coin in his pouch. No one agreed on what he had fought. People will embroider anything, especially when they are afraid. At first, I was amused. Witches already filled a convenient role in my ballads. Sombre figures at the edge of the firelight, hired to slay beasts and vanish before the last verse. They were useful silhouettes, nothing more. Yet, the more I heard about this particular witcher, the less he resembled a shadow, and the more he began to take on shape. There was the miller's daughter who swore he refused her offer of a free night's lodging with a politeness bordering on insult. There was the tax collector who complained that the witcher's haggling over payment was more precise than any royal clerk's. A priest muttered that the man had a talent for asking inconvenient questions about curses and guilt. None of this fit the simple outline of a monster for hire who kills, collects, and leaves. By the time I walked into that roadside inn where we truly met, I had already half written him in my mind. I expected menace wrapped in mystery, a walking threat. I found instead a tired man who moved as if he knew exactly how much effort each step would cost him. He took a place by the wall, back to the corner, eyes travelling from door to window to hearth. No wasted glances, only that habitual awareness you find in sailors who have spent too long listening to the sea. The crowd knew what he was even before they saw the wolf's head medallion. Silence followed him the way it sometimes follows an ill-timed joke. You already know I approached him and offered a drink. Confidence is easier when one has an audience, and the room was very much my audience. He accepted, barely nodding. For a while we sat in a quiet that tasted of unasked questions. Only when a local braggart, eager to impress his companions, began to speak too loudly about freaks and mutants did the mood change. The man was not the first fool to think that insulting someone from a safe distance counts as courage. He leaned back, waved his hands, sent his words across the room like thrown stones. People laughed, but the laughter had an edge. No one looked at Geralt directly, the way people avoid looking at a storm cloud and pretend the sky is still clear. Geralt did not rise to the bait. He finished his drink, set the cup down, and said something short and precise in a voice that carried without being loud. I will not repeat his words. They were not polished enough for a ballad, but they cut the man's bravado neatly in two. a long, brittle pause, an awkward apology, and the inn remembered how to breathe again. I had seen more spectacular confrontations, flying chairs, broken jugs, noses rearranged across faces. Yet this small, controlled moment showed me more about Geralt than any tavern tale of triumphant battles. He did not need to prove himself to a room full of strangers. He needed only to make sure the night did not become messier than it already was. Later, I would see him standing his ground against creatures that twisted the air around them and men whose cruelty weighed more heavily on the world than any clawed beast. But the first time I truly saw the White Wolf was that evening, not in steel or sorcery, but in quiet restraint. A witcher's dangerousness is easy to imagine. His discipline is harder to notice unless you are close enough to feel the ripple when he chooses not to act. Sitting beside him, I understood that his greatest battles were often the ones he refused to fight. There is little glory in that, and almost no coin. It does not make good theatre. Most listeners prefer swords drawn and tables overturned. Restraint is a subtle tune, easily drowned. I'm ashamed to admit that I still turned his stories into something louder than truth. When I sang of that evening later, the braggart became a gang of armed thugs. The words exchanged became threats, and the inn shook with the force of Geralt's righteous anger. They wanted a legend, not a weary man refusing to break another nose. On the road, when we were alone, and the world shrank to the crunch of boots and the creak of leather, he spoke more. Never in speeches, Geralt does not lecture. He offered remarks as sparingly as he used potions, short doses of thought that lingered longer than they took to utter, about contracts that name the price of a beast, but never the cost of leaving a widow, about how the line between monster and victim moves, depending on who holds the pen that writes the contract. I found myself writing differently after those talks. I paused in the middle of boastful stanzas, wondering how much truth I was trimming away for the sake of a cleaner rhyme. Once, by the fire, he listened while I tried a new song, and quietly said that he did not recognize himself in the man I had placed at its center. I asked whether that was not the point of heroes. He shrugged and replied that he was not sure for whom the song had been written, for the people who needed a hero or for the witcher who wished to believe he was one. There, in that uncertain space between how he wished to be seen and how the world chose to see him, I found the core of the story I am now trying to tell. Not the tale of a flawless champion, nor of a heartless killer, but of a man who keeps trying to do a little less harm than the last time, in a world that rarely rewards such modest ambitions. We cheer the victories, we quote the dramatic lines, we repeat the sharpest rumors, but we still wonder whether we ever truly see the person we turn into legend, or only the reflection that best suits our fear and our need for simple tales. I did not see the castle myself. My feet have walked many roads, but not that one on that particular night. What I know of the Striga in Wizim comes from fragments. A few spare sentences from Geralt when the wine had loosened his tongue, a handful of rumours gathered from merchants and guards, and my own relentless imagination filling in the spaces between. Geralt is not an eager storyteller. If you ask directly, he will give you the bare length of a contract, the kind a clerk might write, a king, a curse, a monster, a payment. If you wait and listen carefully, however, small details slip out, like loose stones from a wall, You catch them or lose them. I have made a profession of catching them. From these scattered stones, I built a long corridor in my mind. At the far end of it stood a king who had loved unwisely, and a child born under a twisted shadow. There was a crypt beneath the castle, a stone womb where the princess had slept by day and emerged at night as something that made armed men stay behind barred doors. There were villagers who called her a monster, and a father who called her my daughter with equal ferocity. In Geralt's version, told in pieces, there was very little drama. He spoke of the terms of the contract, of the conditions the king laid down, of the agreement not to simply kill the creature, but to break the curse if possible. All of that was interesting, but not what stayed with me. What I remembered was the way he said child and beast in the same breath, as if both words were true and neither was enough. When I picture the castle in my mind, I do it in the way a bard must, with the moon hanging low and colour leached from the world. The walls rise dark against the sky, the courtyard empty, as if fear has swept all life away. Somewhere below, in the roots of the fortress, a sarcophagus waits, lid pushed aside by hands that are both royal and ravenous. No one is there to see it except the witcher in his worn leather, watching, counting breaths, timing his movements to the long, slow rhythm of the curse. He told me once that it is not the sharpness of teeth that matters most when you face a cursed being, but the sharpness of your timing. A spell has rules, just as music does. Break the pattern and the whole thing falls apart. In Wizim, he had to survive the night without killing the princess, had to keep himself alive long enough to let the curse exhaust itself. It was not a duel in the way minstrels like to describe, full of clashing steel and triumphant shouts. It was endurance, calculation, listening to the grim heartbeat of the spell that had wrapped itself around that child before she took her first breath. There are noble songs that speak of heroes saving maidens from dragons or beasts, but they rarely mention that sometimes the maiden and the beast are one and the same. It is simpler to separate them. Here is the innocent, there is the evil. We like our stories divided neatly, like courses at a royal feast. What do we do, then, with a girl who would have been a princess in another world, and in this one tears her victims apart under a red moon, all because of choices made by adults long before she understood anything at all? Geralt does not philosophize about such things when he speaks. He says only what he did. He went down into the crypt. He stayed there when most men would have run. He used silver and signs, and the small, exhausted margin of his own strength to hold the Striga off until dawn. Because somewhere under all that fury, there was still a living child who had never been asked whether she wanted to be the sharp end of a curse. Sitting by the temple bed while he slept, I imagined that fight as best I could without turning it into the spectacle my profession encourages. No choruses, no triumphant refrain, just a man and the consequences of other people's sins, locked together until the sun remembered to rise. Perhaps that is why the story clung to me more tightly than tales of battles with nameless beasts. It was not a victory over evil in some pure, shining sense. It was an attempt to undo a wrong that could never be fully set right. We all carry our own little versions of that crypt, do we not? Old words spoken in anger, habits we inherit like ill-fitting clothes, the mistakes of those who raised us echoing in our throats before we even realize we are repeating them. Most of us never face them under a blood-red moon, with claws scraping against stone. We meet them instead at family tables, in quiet disappointments. In the moment, we recognize a gesture as not entirely our own. It is less dramatic, but no less real. What struck me most, once I had pieced his account together, was that Geralt never spoke of the Striga with contempt. He reserved more of his criticism for the courtiers and advisers who had allowed the curse to fester, who had wrapped silence around a tragedy until it hardened into superstition. For the girl herself, once the nightmare was over, he had only a tired gentleness in his voice. He hoped she would live a life beyond the shadow of that crypt. He doubted the court would make that easy. A witcher is often hired to erase a problem, to remove an embarrassment that has grown claws or fangs. In Wizim, he was asked to do something much more complicated, to give that problem a chance at being human again. The payment was better than average, so the stories say, but I do not think coin was what stayed with him. Some contracts leave marks that have nothing to do with scars. When I sing this story, I sometimes give the king more lines than he deserves. I let him pace, wring his hands, make noble speeches about responsibility and remorse. The truth is likely less generous. Power seldom expresses guilt gracefully. Yet even if his repentance was clumsy or half-hearted, the fact remains. He chose a witcher, not an executioner. That choice, though small in the grand grinding mechanisms of history, matters more than most songs bother to mention. Geralt would not call himself a saviour. He would say he fulfilled a contract under particular conditions, that the risk was calculated, that luck and endurance did as much as skill. Yet under all his careful wording lies a simple decision: to believe, for one night at least, that a monster might not be the final truth of that girl's existence. It is, in its own quiet way, an act of faith. When you hear the word monster, you might think of claws, teeth, eyes shining in the dark. After travelling with Geralt, I think of something else as well: the ease with which we decide someone is beyond saving. The speed with which we lock them into the role that frightens us least because it is so clear. The Striga in Wizim was terrifying, but she was also a prison for a child. Geralt opened that prison at great cost to himself. Whether the world outside greeted her as a person or continued to see her as a lingering echo of horror is another matter entirely. The night after he told me the last pieces of that tale, we played at a small village inn where the worst danger was a spoiled cask of beer. People requested cheerful songs, wedding tunes, verses about springtime and new beginnings. I sang them all, my fingers moving automatically, while some part of my mind remained in that stone crypt, listening to the slow, stubborn beat of a heart refusing to stop. The villagers laughed, couples danced, the innkeeper counted coins. Life went on at the surface as it always does. Perhaps that is how it should be. If every soul carried every tragedy at the front of their thoughts, the world would freeze. Yet even as we dance and drink and chase away the dark with candles and song, we still wonder whether behind the walls of our own lives there are curses we have not yet faced, and whether anyone will choose, as Geralt did, to believe that something broken might still be turned back toward the light. If you travel long enough with a witcher, you start collecting monsters the way other people collect recipes or family sayings. In every village, there is a tale waiting at the gate. Grandmothers lean over fences to whisper about things that scratch at shutters. Children claim a beast lives in the well and eats only naughty boys. Innkeepers swear that something with 3 heads and 7 tails prowls the crossroads, though no one has ever stayed outside long enough to count. Before Geralt, I treated such stories as convenient fodder. A pinch of exaggeration here, a touch of horror there, and suddenly a modest nuisance became a mighty terror fit for the grandest hall. What I had not realized was how tightly fear and imagination twist around a small, stubborn core of truth. With a witcher at your side, you begin to see where the threads separate. Take the poor Kikimora, for instance. To hear some peasants describe it, you would think a single specimen could devour a city wall and swallow a church bell whole. In reality, the one I saw was an ugly, spidery creature dragged behind Geralt's horse through the morning mist. Impressive in its way, but hardly the titanic horror of legend. Its true danger lay in ambush and venom, not in sheer size. Yet, when we delivered the carcass, the villagers could not help enlarging it in every retelling, as though they felt cheated if the terror that haunted their nights did not match the scale of their dread. Geralt rarely corrected them. He would name the creature, list its habits if asked, accept his pay, and let the rumors run wild. They need their stories, he told me once, while we sat on a fence watching a group of boys poke nervously at the Kikimora's limp legs from a safe distance. If the monster turns out to be smaller than they imagined, at least the story can stay big. I protested that stories ought to aim for truth. He snorted and reminded me of several ballads of mine that bore only the faintest resemblance to the events I had actually witnessed. That was unkind, but not entirely inaccurate. A tavern crowd loves clean lines and sharp edges. They would rather hiss at a clear villain than sit through a debate about soil quality, inheritance law, and bad harvests. On another road, in the shadow of a neglected manor house, the gap between rumour and reality took on a different shape. People in the nearby hamlets spoke of a beast that dragged travellers into its lair, a fiend with eyes like coals and a maw full of razors. They drew pictures in the air with shaking fingers, horns, claws, shaggy fur matted with blood. A classic, respectable monster. What Geralt found there was a cursed nobleman named Nivellen, trapped in a form that was part man, part beast, more tragic than terrifying. He welcomed the witcher like a lonely host greeting a long-expected guest, offering food, wine, and uneasy jokes. The true danger in that house lay not in him, but in the quiet, lethal presence that shared his home, a bruxa with a voice like a beautiful nightmare. Geralt described her with a few spare sentences, the way she moved, the way her song bent the air, the inhuman stillness in her gaze, and fell silent. If I had heard only the villagers' side, I would have written an ordinary song about a terrible creature slain by a brave witcher. After Geralt's account, the tale refused to fit that frame. Who, in that crumbling manor, was the monster in the way people meant the word? The cursed man whose worst crimes lay buried in his past? Or the vampire whose hunger was simply what she was? Or perhaps the monster was the silence that had allowed guilt and loneliness to thicken, until nothing living could breathe easily there. Out on the road, it is tempting to believe in sharp lines. You see something with fangs, you call it evil. You see something with a human face, you call it good, at least until it proves otherwise. Yet, the more evenings I spent listening to Geralt sort through contracts and rumours, the more those lines blurred. There were harmless creatures chased from their dens because they looked frightening, and respectable men whose smiles hid appetites no witcher was paid to confront. Once, in a prosperous little town that smelled of fresh bread and well-fed horses, the mayor hired Geralt to deal with a demon troubling his grain warehouse. The description was spectacular: glowing eyes, horns, hooves, striking sparks. When we arrived, the demon turned out to be a clever Sylvan who had been helping local elves steal sacks of grain in a clumsy attempt at evening out the chronic unfairness of taxes. The negotiation that followed was half farce, half sermon. Geralt tried to convince the Sylvan to stop kicking human guards in the head. I did my best to keep both sides from calling each other names that would make peace impossible. In the end, the real problem was not the creature at all, but the brittle resentment between the human farmers and their non-human neighbours. The monster was only the most visible symptom of a sickness that lived in old laws and older grudges. It would have been easy and profitable to write a rousing tune about a devil driven out and a town saved. Instead, I composed nothing for months, paralyzed by the feeling that any simple version of the story would be dishonest. How do you rhyme unfair quotas and quiet hunger in 3 neat verses and a chorus people can dance to? Audiences are delighted to hear that evil comes with horns and a tail. They are less eager to sing along when you tell them it sometimes wears good boots and a mare's ring. Sitting by a campfire with my lute in my lap, listening to Geralt polish his swords in the half-light, I began to suspect that the true power of monsters in our world did not lie only in what they could do to flesh and bone. It lay also in what people used them to justify. A rumoured beast near the border could excuse a convenient patrol. Tales of non-humans stealing children could mask the uglier truth of land disputes and fear of difference. A witcher was called in to swing a blade at the symptom while the disease continued to thrive. Geralt knew this. It showed in the questions he asked before taking a contract, in the way he watched the people who wanted someone or something removed. He weighed more than the coins on the table. I tried to learn from that, to let my own questions sharpen, though mine were made of ink instead of steel. Of course, I am still a bard. I have bills to pay, and an audience that prefers a clear villain to hiss at, and a tidy ending to hum on the way home. Sometimes when the mood in a tavern is high, and the ale is strong, I lean back into the old patterns. The towering beast, the fearless witcher, the grateful townsfolk. It is a comfortable melody, familiar and safe. But on quieter nights, like this one, when the wind fingers at the shutters and the road waits outside like an unrolled scroll, I try to do better. I play slower songs, ones that leave room for uncertainty. I talk about creatures whose only crime was to be born in the wrong shape, about villages that asked for a sword when what they needed was a different kind of courage. I talk about a witcher who often tried against his own training and against the expectations of those who paid him, to see more than the label monster. Listeners still clap, though sometimes more softly. Some look away, uncomfortable. Others stare into their cups, as if the dregs might rearrange themselves into answers. And we still wonder whether, by telling stories that admit how complicated our fears can be, we make the world a little safer, or only a little harder to ignore when the lights go out. The first time I heard the name Butcher of Blaviken, it arrived without context, swaddled in outrage and spilled beer. We were sitting in a cramped tavern far from the coast, the sort of place where people argued loudly about taxes they did not understand and wars they had never seen. Someone at the next table mentioned a witcher, and an older man with a crooked nose spat the word butcher as if it were a bone stuck in his throat. My attention, naturally, sharpened. There are few things more irresistible to a bard than a scandal they have somehow missed. I leaned closer, pretending to adjust the cup on our table. Geralt, across from me, flicked a glance at the speaker and then at me, a warning in his eyes that I ignored in the way only an old friend can. The story, as the crooked-nosed man told it, was simple, clean, and entirely wrong. A stranger had come to Blaviken, made deals with magicians and outlaws, and ended by cutting down innocent people in the market square. Children screamed, women fainted, blood soaked the cobblestones. He put his hand dramatically over his heart as he spoke, as if he had personally bled on those stones. I knew better than to look at Geralt while the tale grew more lurid. I watched the room instead. Faces tightened at the mention of the name. Even those who had clearly not been within a week's ride of Blaviken nodded along with the witness's certainty. Stories spread faster than trade goods. By the time they arrive, they have been polished smooth, all awkward corners sanded away. Eventually, when the outrage had reached a satisfying pitch, I cleared my throat and asked a few harmless questions. What exactly had the Witcher done before that fateful day? With whom had he been seen? How many of the victims had been merchants? How many had been armed? Details wavered. The man was sure there had been a sorcerer involved, though he could not remember his name. There was a girl, too, sometimes a princess, sometimes merely a bandit with good cheekbones, depending on how much wine had been poured into the account. The innocent people became, upon gentle probing, people who were standing near other people, some of whom had been holding weapons in a way that sounded far from peaceful. Still, the core remained. A witcher had drawn steel in a public square and left the town with a new, poisonous title. No one sang of him as a saviour there. They cursed his shadow. Later that night, when the tavern had emptied and Geralt was checking the edge of his sword with a practised thumb, I finally asked him outright. "Blaviken," I said quietly, "was it you?" He did not answer at once. The fire snapped and rearranged its own embers. Outside, someone argued with a mule. When he spoke, his voice was very even, as if he were reciting a list of supplies. "There was a town," he said, "a sorcerer who wanted to hide, a woman who wanted revenge, a gang who wanted blood and coin. They were all on a path that ended in that square." He did not give me names, but I could feel them hanging unspoken in the air. I had heard whispers of a mage barricaded in a tower, of a girl wronged and hardened into something sharp, of hired blades following her like crows after a plough. "I tried to keep them from meeting," he said. "I failed. So I chose a lesser evil." That phrase, on its own, would fit neatly into a song. It has weight, a rhythm, a moral flavour that audiences love. Yet the way he said it stripped away all poetry. There was no pride in his voice, no self-congratulation for having averted some larger disaster. Only exhaustion and the weary acceptance of someone who knows that choosing the lesser of two evils does not make you good. It only makes you tired. He told me little of the fight itself. A marketplace, early light, stalls still being arranged. The smell of fish, damp crates, anxiety. A confrontation, words offered like last-minute bargains. Refusals. Then movement too fast for a bystander's eye, steel flashing, people shouting. A handful of bodies on the ground before most onlookers had even understood whose side they were supposed to be on. "You killed them," I said, because someone had to say it. Yes, her as well. Yes, no excuses. He could have spoken of necessity, of the dozens who might have died if he had allowed the gang to carry out their threat, of the sorcerer whose death would have set loose other disasters. He did not. He simply acknowledged what his blades had done. The silence after that word was heavier than any litany could have been. From a distance, the citizens of Blaviken saw a man stride into their square and cut down people who, to them, were at least familiar. They did not know the warning signs Geralt had listened to, the promises made in dark corners, the weight of old crimes pressing the future into a particular shape. They saw only blood on stone and a stranger standing in the middle of it. Their fear needed a word to make sense of that image. Butcher was close at hand. In my profession, I might have been tempted to invert the tale. Saviour of Blaviken has a pleasant ring to it after all. Yet even that felt false. How could I shape a song that honoured what he had done without ignoring the horror of it? How could I pretend that the families of those dead in the square would ever care about hypothetical lives saved? So I did what bards are not supposed to do. For a long time, I did not sing about Blaviken at all. I carried the story like a stone in my pocket, turning it over in my fingers during long rides, feeling its edges dig into my palm. When people spat out the nickname in taverns, I watched Geralt choose silence over defence, and I began to understand that sometimes the price of doing what you believe to be least wrong is that you lose the right to correct how others name you. It is an uncomfortable lesson, and not one that sells many tankards. We prefer thinking that good deeds will be recognized as such, that sacrifice is rewarded with gratitude. We build statues in our minds of those who take on burdens for us, polish away their doubts, their missteps, their compromises. A hero stained by necessity feels like an offence against our craving for clear stories. Yet the world Geralt moves through does not bend itself around our preferences. In that world, you can save a town and be cast out from it in the same breath. You can prevent a massacre and still be the only person on the cobblestones holding a bloody sword. Sometimes when I stand before a crowd and they call for tales of witches, I think of Blaviken and choose something else. A lighter adventure, a monster safely inhuman, a victory with no widows counting the cost. It is easier for them and for me. But on certain nights, when the room is quiet and the air feels ready for heavier truths, I tell a version of the story that does not fit into neat lines. I do not call him butcher or saviour. I call him a man who tried to stand in the path of something terrible and paid for it with a name he will never quite be free of. The listeners shift when I reach that part. Some frown, displeased with the lack of a clean moral. Others stare into the candle flames as if hoping for an answer there. And we still wonder whether a world that insists on turning every complicated act into either a ballad or a curse leaves any space at all for those who live in between, carrying choices that no song, however skilled, can truly set right. Kings, I have learned, are simply villagers with better tailors and more expensive anxieties. They fear different things, that is all. Peasants fear bad harvests and wolves. Kings fear bad harvests, wolves, and the knowledge that everyone is watching to see whom they blame when things go wrong. A witcher has work in both worlds. He might spend 1 week knee-deep in a bog, chasing something that hisses in 3 languages, and the next scrubbed briskly clean in a palace antechamber while a steward explains how to address His Majesty without causing an international incident. I have seen Geralt look more uncomfortable in polished marble halls than in any haunted forest. One court in particular lingers in my memory. The banners were rich enough to pay a village's taxes for a decade. Heavy cloth painted with symbols that meant everything and nothing. Lions, crowns, swords, a scattering of stars. Servants moved like well-trained birds, all quick steps and downcast eyes. Somewhere a choir practiced, their sweet notes spilling into corridors where treaties were being quietly sharpened to points. We had been summoned because something with claws and an unhelpful sense of drama had begun to attack border patrols. The courtiers spoke of it in vague terms, the way people speak of scandals still in progress. A beast, they said, and let the word carry everything they preferred not to name directly. Fear, embarrassment, the possibility that their enemies were already whispering about royal incompetence. While I adjusted my doublet and practiced a suitably respectful bow in a polished shield, I watched Geralt. He wore the same worn leather as always, only slightly cleaner, but even stripped of mud and travel dust, he did not look like a hound at anyone's heel. That alone made half the court uneasy. They wanted a tool, not a guest. The king received us on a raised dais beneath an elaborate fresco showing a previous monarch trampling some symbolic serpent. His face had the set expression of a man who has been listening to bad news for too many days in a row. To his left, advisers clustered with the air of people who would rather be alone with their ledgers. To his right, a priest fingered his amulet, as if trying to remind the gods which side they ought to favour. Formalities were observed. Names, titles, a polite murmur of welcome that did not quite cover the impatience beneath. Only when the doors were shut and the last echo of ceremony faded did the real conversation begin. The king's shoulders dropped fractionally, and his voice lost its grand hall resonance, becoming that of a man asking a craftsman whether a broken wheel can be mended before the caravan must leave. He wanted the beast gone. He wanted his people safe. He wanted, perhaps most of all, the neighbouring kingdom to stop smirking over goblets of wine. His counsellors argued in cautious phrases about bounties, patrol routes, and the political cost of admitting weakness. Geralt listened, asking short, practical questions. How often? Where? What signs left behind? No one had bothered to count the tracks. They had been too busy counting rumours. I am fond of such rooms. They are full of potential songs, sharp remarks disguised as compliments, alliances danced rather than declared, the rustle of silk hiding sharper noises. But that day, watching Geralt, I saw something else. To him, this was simply another nest of variables. A royal contract was not so different from a village one, except that the table was better and the people around it more practiced at pretending they were not afraid. When talk turned to payment, the air thickened. A king may command armies, but he will still haggle if he thinks there is a coin to be saved. Someone mentioned the honour of serving the crown. Geralt replied very calmly that honour did not sharpen blades or feed horses. For a moment the room held its breath, waiting for outrage. Instead, the king smiled thinly, as one professional recognizing another. A better sum was offered, along with a few quiet conditions that said more about politics than about monsters, discretion, speed, no unnecessary alarm among the populace. That last phrase always amuses me, as if panic were a spigot one could turn gently off, as if people, having heard that patrols do not return, could be soothed by the absence of official statements. Courts prefer silence because it can be controlled. Fear, like music, travels by other routes. It struck me then that a witcher's work with kings is not merely about claws and teeth. It is also about narrative. A monster on the border is a problem, but it is also a story that can spread in directions unhelpful to the crown. Hiring a witcher is as much about shaping that story as it is about solving the immediate danger. The king acted swiftly. The threat was dealt with. Order was restored. These are the lines royal chroniclers prefer to write. After the audience, as we walked through galleries lined with portraits of ancestors who all looked as if they had been carved from the same slightly anxious block of wood, I teased Geralt about it. Did he ever tire of being used as a footnote in someone else's official record? The Witcher came, the Witcher killed, the king was wise to call him. He shrugged and said that contracts are contracts, whether signed in a muddy yard or on parchment bearing 5 seals. The important part to him was that people stopped dying, and the coin was real. Yet even he, I think, felt the difference when he rode out under the gaze of a court that would later claim his success as a natural extension of its own good governance. The hunt itself was, from my vantage point, less grand than the preliminaries. We rode, we questioned frightened farmers, we followed marks along a river bank where reeds hid more frogs than horrors. The creature, when we finally faced it, was dangerous enough, strong, fast, ill-tempered, but it did not care in the slightest about borders or banners. It wanted only to feed and to be left alone. When it lay still at last, the forest returned to its ordinary sounds. Birds resumed their interrupted conversations. I wiped sweat from my face and tried not to dwell on how close its claws had come to rearranging my future compositions into an unfinished oeuvre. Geralt examined the body with professional care, making sure there would be no unpleasant surprises at the next moon. The whole affair, stripped of the palace's anxious embellishments, was simply work. Back at court, however, the mood transformed. Relief flowed through the corridors like expensive perfume. The king spoke of duty fulfilled and subjects protected. Courtiers repeated the phrases with small adjustments, already rehearsing how they would sound in other halls. The beast, which had been a humiliation when alive, became a useful anecdote when dead. Proof of vigilance, a chance to remind allies and rivals alike that this crown still had sharp answers to sharp problems. Geralt accepted his payment, bowed with the minimum required depth, and retreated gratefully from the cloying incense of gratitude. I stayed a little longer, playing in the great hall that evening. My songs were well received. Noble ladies smiled. Courtiers requested the usual favourites. No one asked to hear the frightened stammering of the farmer whose son had not returned, or the shaky laugh of the young guard, who admitted he had almost run when the reeds first shook. Those were not courtly sounds. On nights like that, I become acutely aware of the distance between the stories we reward and the truths we quietly bury, because they do not fit on a scroll. A king's request to a witcher is framed as an act of wise leadership, yet beneath it lie layers of neglect, miscalculation, and ordinary human blindness. Monster hunts rarely begin in a vacuum. They grow in the cracks we prefer not to examine. When people ask me what it is like to travel with Geralt among the great and powerful, I could tell them about sumptuous feasts and glittering jewels, about tapestries that take 3 years to weave and are glanced at for 3 heartbeats by distracted guests. But more often, what I remember is the look on a ruler's face when the doors close and titles no longer shield them from the knowledge that something is killing their people and they do not know how to stop it themselves. We like to imagine that those above us always know what they are doing, that their decisions are guided by wisdom rather than by fear of looking foolish. It is a comforting illusion. Standing beside Geralt in those halls, listening to the hesitation behind decisive words, I began to suspect that power is often just a more elaborate way of being afraid. And we still wonder whether trusting such fear to hire men like Geralt, when monsters appear, is the best the world can hope for, or simply the only arrangement we have grown too used to question. If courts are theatres, then betrothal feasts are their most elaborate comedies. Always one spilled goblet from tragedy. The night we rode to Sintra, I expected spectacle. A princess displayed, suitors preening, a queen conducting it all like a general arranging troops. I did not expect destiny to appear as an uninvited guest. Sintra's great hall clung to the cliff above the sea. Waves crashed below, while torches painted the stone in restless gold. Tapestries stirred. Tables groaned under food no one would recall. People rarely remember what they ate on the night their lives quietly changed direction. Queen Calanthe sat at the high table, her crown a minor accessory compared to the sharp certainty in her eyes. Beside her, Pavetta looked smaller than the songs, shoulders tight, hands on the table as if bracing for impact. Around them clustered suitors and envoys, men wearing their lineage like armour. Laughing too loudly, watching one another more closely than they watched the woman whose future they were bargaining for. Geralt sat lower in the hall, not hidden, not honoured, placed where a useful instrument might be kept within reach. In worn leather, among velvets, he looked to most eyes like another hired sword. Only those who knew how carefully Calanthe chose her guests would have noticed the weight of his very lack of ornament. I was there with my lute, half decoration, half emergency device. A ballad could soften tempers. A dance tune could steer conversation away from dangerous rocks. At first, the evening followed its script. Toasts, sharpened compliments, a quarrel over seating that I smothered beneath a lively tune. Calanthe moved through it all like a conductor, nudging suitors into rivalry with a glance, flattering them into believing it was their own wit at work. Pavetta's silence deepened. It might have looked like shyness. To me, it felt like air before a storm. Then the doors opened, and the script tore in half. A knight entered in full armour, face concealed, walking with the brittle dignity of someone who expects to be hated and intends to endure it standing. He named himself, invoked an old promise, and claimed Pavetta's hand under the law of surprise. Sung by bards, that law sounds charming. A man saved from death offers what he does not yet know he possesses: a harvest, a puppy, a child. In that hall it felt less like poetry, and more like a rusted trap closing. Calanthe's expression hardened, then smoothed. The suitors protested, shouting about madness and insult. Councillors whispered of precedent. Priests spoke of vows. Beneath their words coiled a simpler question: how much reality could a queen afford to ignore when an old promise stood in front of her, breathing? In the midst of this, Calanthe turned to Geralt. Rulers call on witches for more than claws and curses. When they do not know which story they have stumbled into, they look for someone who has survived stranger ones. She asked for his counsel, shaping the question so that whatever he answered could later be quoted as justification. He could have stayed safely shallow, speaking only of treaties and appearances. Instead, he answered as a man who has seen the law of surprise twist lives out of shape. He spoke of promises the world itself seems stubborn about enforcing. His words did not please the queen. Truth rarely dresses for court. Voices rose. The cursed knight defended his claim with more dignity than most uncursed nobles. Pavetta trembled under the weight of everyone deciding her future as if she were a chest of coin. Calanthe hovered between fury and calculation, pulled between love, pride, and a vow spoken years earlier on some distant road. Then the air broke. Pavetta's long-suppressed power erupted. The hall became a storm. Tables lifted, goblets flew, and men who had never feared steel discovered they were terrified of being thrown against their own ceiling. Through it moved Geralt, not with flourishes, but with that ruthless economy he brings to any fight. When the storm subsided, Pavetta stood with the knight at her side, his curse broken. The hall looked as if destiny had redecorated it with bare hands. Calanthe now faced a choice no queen envies: deny the law and risk more than shattered plates, or accept a future she had not drafted. She chose in the only way that did not betray both her granddaughter's heart and her own honour. The law of surprise, apparently satisfied, might have left. It did not. The grateful knight, eager to repay his happiness, offered Geralt a reward not yet possessed. Geralt refused, as he always refuses such open doors in reality that lead to closed corridors in fate. But refusal met insistence, and the old words were spoken aloud. A glass slipped. Pavetta clutched her middle. Realization spread faster than the spilled wine. An unborn child had just been written into a story she had no say in. In that instant, I looked at Geralt. There was no triumph on his face, no awe, only something like dread, as if a chain had been dropped around his shoulders with a soft final sound. Later, among servants sweeping crockery into piles, I asked whether he believed in destiny. He said belief was beside the point. Queens, peasants, sorcerers and knights believed. and so their choices would bend around that belief like branches around a stone. As we left Sintra, the sea still arguing with the cliffs below, I thought of that unchosen child, and of the witcher who had tried to live by simple contracts, now bound to a promise spoken in a hall he had not come to shape. And I wondered, as I still do, whether calling such things destiny is our way of excusing promises made too lightly, or whether there truly is a hand somewhere, writing names into stories long before we are ready to live them. Maps lie. They do it politely, with neat ink and decorative borders. But they lie all the same. A line of trees becomes a shaded patch. A mountain shrinks to a tasteful triangle. And at the edges, where knowledge frays, cartographers write comforting phrases like wasteland or uninhabited. It is easier to pretend the world stops where your certainty does. Travelling with Geralt, I learned that the so-called edge of the world is usually where other people's patience runs out. Beyond the last tidy fields, beyond the villages that send taxes and prayers toward distant capitals, there are places that belong to older stories. On some roads, the moment you pass the last milestone bearing a king's sigil, the air itself seems to remember it was once not asked for permission. One such journey began with a simple rumour in a prosperous market town. A devil in the fields, ruining crops, terrorizing peasants, demanding offerings. Exactly the sort of tale that makes a witcher's medallion twitch and a bard's imagination stretch. There were hoof prints, they said, strange laughter, horns glimpsed at twilight. The local priest railed about punishment. The aldermen fretted about lost grain, and both agreed that someone ought to be paid to make the problem go away. I remember walking beside Geralt along the rutted track that led out of town, listening to the countryside change its voice. Behind us lay the ordered grumble of wagons and forges. Ahead, the wind had a wilder humour. Here and there, abandoned shrines leaned in the grass, their offerings long since stolen by weather and birds. It felt as if we were stepping off the neat ink of the map and into whatever the cartographer had chosen not to draw. You already know something of what we found. Not a horned fiend from the bowels of nightmare, but a sylvan with the manners of a disgruntled goat and the heart of a naive revolutionary helping elves steal grain to ease their hunger. He kicked like a mule and swore like a soldier, but his crimes were small compared to the weight of history pressing on the people he aided. That encounter might have been only a farce, an amusing anecdote about a trickster creature and some stolen sacks, if the path behind it had not led further past the fields, into forests, where the air held another kind of silence. The humans in nearby villages called that region the edge of the world, and they meant it. To them, nothing lay beyond but rocks and old ghosts. They were wrong. We walked into a valley where the trees grew closer together, as if consulting one another before letting us pass. Birdsong thinned. The ground softened underfoot. It felt like entering a story older than my craft. I tightened my grip on the lute, as if the wood might decide it belonged more to the forest than to me. There, in the hush between branches, we met the people who truly lived at the world's rim. Elves who had retreated from lands they once considered theirs, watching human ploughs cut lines through memories like scars through skin. They held bows in calloused hands, eyes bright with the kind of bitterness that does not need to raise its voice. To them, we were the intruders from the centre, the ones who walked under new flags and pretended fields had always stopped where they now did. I will not repeat every word that passed between Geralt and their leaders. Some were sharp, others weary. The elves saw in him a killer of beasts for hire, a tool of the new order. In me they saw less than that, a travelling noisemaker whose songs had almost certainly helped normalize the very assumptions that had driven them into the trees. It is a peculiar sensation to stand before those who have been pushed to the margins and realize that your art, however unintentionally, has lent rhythm to the pushing. I had sung of brave settlers taming empty land, of valiant soldiers defending borders against nameless foes. Empty, nameless. Such convenient words for places and people someone has decided do not count. Geralt, in his way, tried to pare the situation down to its bones. He pointed out that grain is grain, hunger is hunger, arrows are arrow. None of these care much for poetry or politics. But even he could not pretend that we were not walking through the consequences of centuries, the slow erosion of one people's world under another's advance. In that valley, monsters were not the problem. There were no fanged horrors leaping from the undergrowth, no cursed ruins oozing malevolence. The danger lay in the narrowness of everyone's options. The elves could leave or starve or fight. The humans in the villages could tighten their borders, harden their hearts, or learn to share with those they had been taught to fear. None of these paths promised glory. All promised loss. When we finally turned back toward the lands men still felt comfortable mapping, the edge of the world did not feel distant at all. It felt uncomfortably close, a seam running just under the surface of the stories people told about themselves. In one, humans were brave pioneers. In another, invaders. In both, they rarely questioned the assumption that the center of the map belonged to them. I found, after that journey, that certain rhymes stuck in my throat. The easy phrases about savage hordes and noble settlers began to taste of ash. In taverns where farmers cursed non-humans for existing too near their fences, I remembered the quiet, controlled fury in elven eyes, the way they spoke of orchards cut down and rivers renamed. It would have been simple and safer to keep my songs aligned with the prevailing ink. Yet some part of me, the part that had walked under those listening trees, would not let the matter rest. I began to weave small hesitations into my verses. A line suggesting that the empty wilds once had other names. A verse hinting that those driven to the forests were not shadows, but people with their own stories, even if no map-maker bothered to ink them. The response was mixed. A few listeners frowned, not at the tune, but at the implication. Others simply did not notice. A song is, for many, only a polite noise to drink to. Yet occasionally someone would grow very still, gaze turned inward, as if a half-forgotten picture had stirred behind their eyes. On those nights, I felt that the road to the world's edge had not been entirely wasted on a vain bard. As for Geralt, he kept doing what he has always done, taking contracts where people feared what they did not understand, weighing the coin against his own stubborn sense of what harm he was willing to be party to. He was not a champion of elven causes, nor a defender of human expansion. He was simply a mod trying to walk a line between them without pretending that the ground beneath his feet was anything but uneven. Maps will continue to lie. New borders will be drawn, old ones erased, edges renamed until the parchment grows crowded with corrections. Somewhere, as ink dries, there will still be valleys where people remember that the world once looked different, and where the phrase edge of the world is less about geography than about where someone else decided they no longer needed to listen. I play in both sorts of places now, in warm halls where lords point at charts, and in smoky huts where people speak of trees that will not grow back. Between verses, between towns, I think of that unseen seam and the lives balanced along it. And we still wonder whether telling ourselves that the world ends where our comfort does is not the most dangerous illusion of all, more perilous than any monster lurking beyond the last tidy line on the map. Love, as I often inform tavern audiences, is the finest excuse for foolishness ever devised. They laugh, imagining jealous husbands and mistaken balconies. They do not picture a sorceress hurling furniture at invisible forces, while a witcher clings to a shattered windowsill, and I, your humble narrator, try very hard not to die because of a rhyming error. It began, as many bad decisions in my life have begun, with my ambition to improve a song. I wanted a rhymed curse, something to impress the ladies and perhaps convince innkeepers to stop underpaying me. Instead of a harmless flourish, I managed to pull a genuine djinn out of the morning sky over a quiet river. Inspiration and catastrophe often share an entrance. You may have heard that scene retold as comedy. Dandelion in a boat, shouting phrases in elder speech he barely understands. Geralt rolling his eyes, then everything exploding into chaos. It was less amusing from my position. Struggling to breathe while invisible fingers tore at my lungs. I remember fragments, Geralt's shout, the flare of a sign, the feeling of the world folding strangely around me. Pain, then numbness, then the cool darkness of being carried. When you are dying, or convinced you are, which feels much the same, you notice odd details. I recall the creak of saddle leather, the smell of Geralt's cloak, the way his voice stayed calm even as he rode hard for help. Help, in this case, wore lilac and gooseberries. We reached a town whose name is less important than the fact that it had a sorceress in residence, Yennefer of Vengerberg. I'd heard of her. Bards collect gossip about mages the way squirrels hoard nuts. Her reputation was a mixture of admiration, fear, and the particular awe reserved for storms glimpsed from too far away to judge their true size. I was barely conscious when Geralt carried me into her house, so my first impression of Yennefer is mostly voice and scent. The voice, cool, precise, carrying an amusement that never quite reached pity. The scent, like stepping into a memory you are not sure you ever lived. She examined me briefly, weighed my life against her interests, and decided I was worth at least a little effort. While I drifted between worlds, their bargain unfolded. Geralt wanted me cured. Yennefer wanted the djinn. Sorcerers are collectors who have decided that reality itself is a set of shelves waiting to be filled. To her, a bound elemental was not merely dangerous, but fascinating. Another piece in a pattern only she could see. From my bed, I heard fragments of their conversation, sharp as glass. His voice, low and tense, insisting on my safety. Hers, cool and edged, teasing, testing, probing for weakness as much as for information. She called him Witcher with a tone that made the word sound almost like an insult and almost like an invitation. When I finally staggered to my feet, the inn had become a stage for her power. She did not need armor. Her presence was enough. Geralt watched as he watches anything potentially lethal. It would be easy, in a simpler song, to say they hated each other at first sight. The truth was more complicated. They recognized one another not from past meetings, but from the particular loneliness that clings to those reshaped by forces larger than themselves. He by mutagens and training, she by magic and the expectations of her order. Their dance that day wound through arguments about risk, control, and the small matter of my life. Yennefer turned my brush with death into bait, using the lingering connection with the djinn to lure it. Geralt objected. She smiled and continued anyway. Sorceresses do not reach her rank by yielding when a man frowns disapprovingly, even if that man carries 2 swords and a reputation for killing the unkillable. When the djinn finally arrived, it did so with the offended fury of something ancient dragged into a domestic quarrel. The inn shuddered. Walls cracked. Invisible claws tore at the air. Yennefer stood at the center of the storm, hair whipped by forces that would have flung lesser beings through the ceiling, hands weaving patterns I could barely follow. Geralt naturally threw himself into the path of danger, which in this case meant trying to break her control before the djinn tore her apart. It should tell you something about both of them that neither considered standing back and letting the other court disaster alone. That, I think, was the true beginning of whatever lies between them. Not a glance across a crowded room, but 2 stubborn souls refusing to let the other die on their own terms. I will not dissect the last wish itself. I know pieces, guesses, choked hints. Geralt has never told me the exact words he used to bind his fate to hers, and I have never pushed as hard as I could. Some mysteries are more honest as silences. What I do know is this. When the djinn departed, tearing itself free from a trap that had become something else, the air in the room changed, the way a melody does when it finally finds its true key. Afterwards, amid the wreckage, they lay together as if the world had been temporarily persuaded not to interfere. I remember thinking, through the ache in my body and the ringing in my ears, that destiny sometimes chooses the strangest corridors. A miscast spell in a boat, a wounded bard on a sorceress's table, an argument about wishes, and suddenly 2 lives tangled in a knot no sword could cleanly cut. In taverns, when I sing of Geralt and Yennefer, listeners lean forward for the dramatic parts, the shattered inn, the blazing eyes, the wild magic. I give them some of that, but in my own memory, the quieter images endure. Geralt standing between her and an enraged elemental. Yennefer bending over me later with a frown that suggested my survival was an irritation she had unexpectedly grown fond of. Love, if that is the word we dare use for them, did not make either of them better in the simple way ballads promise. It did not tame Geralt's doubts or soften Yennefer's sharp edges. It merely gave their solitude a different shape, one that could hurt in new directions. And we still wonder whether such bonds are a gift from whatever gods remain, or just another form of wish dangerous, irreversible, and never granted in quite the way we imagine when we first speak the words. People assume that, because I talk so much, I must also know much. It is an understandable mistake. Words sound like knowledge when you stack enough of them together. But there are silences in my life that no verse has ever bridged, and one of them is shaped like a wish whispered into the teeth of an ancient elemental. I know this much. A djinn offers 3 wishes. I squandered the first 2 with the talent for disaster that has brought you so many of my best songs. The last one belonged to Geralt. He spoke it in that shattered bedroom while the world trembled, and Yennefer stood at the centre of the storm, risking herself for power or freedom, or perhaps simply because she refused to be told what she could not do. I was not there to hear the words. By then I was back in the inn, lungs aching, head ringing, feeling the way a lute must feel after someone has tried to play it with an axe. What reached me were aftershocks, the howl of breaking magic, a sudden, uncanny stillness, and then the quiet murmur of Yennefer's voice, gone softer than I had yet heard it. When they came downstairs later, the inn looked as though a brawl between several armies and a small avalanche had just ended. Plaster hung from the ceiling in sulky lumps. Tables lay on their sides like exhausted animals. The innkeeper hovered on the edge of outrage, calculating damages versus the terror of demanding payment from a woman whose eyes still held remnants of violet fire. Geralt and Yennefer walked as if returning from a place no one else could see. Not triumphant, not chastened, simply changed. They did not speak of the wish. In the weeks that followed, I tried, of course I tried, to pry it out of them. Indirectly at first, with jokes about the many things a man might be foolish enough to ask for when pressed against death and desire at once. Wealth, youth, a kingdom, immunity to my singing. Geralt responded with a thin smile that did not involve his eyes. Yennefer, when such jests reached her, merely raised an eyebrow in a way that made the back of my neck tingle and changed the subject. Later, when wine had loosened one or both of them, I tried a more serious approach. The djinn had left Yennefer alive, which by all rational accounts it should not have done. There are rules to such bindings, old and exacting. Something in Geralt's wish had bent those rules. There are only a few possibilities, I told him once by a riverside campfire. You asked it to spare her. You asked it to break her link to the elemental. Or you asked it for something that made killing her impossible. He stared into the flames for so long, I thought he had chosen not to answer at all. Finally, he said only, "You think too much, Dandelion." "That is demonstrably untrue," I replied. "If I thought enough, my life would contain fewer catastrophes." He grunted, which is Geraltian for possibly. The conversation went no further. With Yennefer I fared no better. On a rare calm morning, when tempers were banked and the scent of her magic did not sting quite so sharply, I ventured a careful question. "Whatever he wished," I said, "it tied you to him. The djinn's bond is gone, but something remains. You feel it. Anyone with eyes can see it." She looked at me over the rim of her cup. "You are a bard," she said. "Surely you, of all people, understand that some words are not meant for an audience." "You think I want to put them in a song?" I protested, wounded in all my professional dignity. She smiled then, a small, crooked smile that acknowledged both the lie and the truth under it. "Of course you do. It is your nature. But this one stays unwritten. So I was left with what any storyteller dreads. A gap. A crucial turning point wrapped in silence. From that moment on, their lives bent toward and away from each other in patterns that made no sense unless you believed that something had been fixed beneath the surface. They would clash, part, find one another again, as if drawn by a hand neither of them wished to admit they felt. Some whispered that Geralt had wished for her love. Those people have clearly never watched Yennefer argue. Love given by compulsion would have broken her faster than any curse. Others claimed he wished that they could never be parted. That too rings false. They separated often enough, both physically and in temper, though never quite cleanly. My own theory, which I will never have the courage to test, is simpler and crueler. I suspect he wished for their fates to be joined in such a way that whatever happened to one would matter irrevocably to the other. Not control, not eternal togetherness, but a binding of importance. Enough to keep the djinn from killing her, because in harming her it would harm him. Enough to ensure that from that moment on, neither could truly pretend the other was just a passing complication. Would he admit that, even to himself? I doubt it. Geralt distrusts grand declarations. He prefers to believe his life is governed by coin, contracts, the daily arithmetic of risk and reward. Destiny to him is a word other people use to excuse what they would rather not take responsibility for. Yet after the last wish, his path and Yennefer's continued to cross in ways too pointed for simple coincidence. I watched them try to pull apart, each driven by their own pride, their wounds, their stubborn ideas of what they deserved, and I watched the world quietly contrive to push them together again, at the crookedest moments. Do I think the wish caused all of this? No. People are fully capable of entangling themselves without supernatural assistance. But I think his words in that ruined room crystallized something that was already forming between them. The way pressure turns common stone into something harder, sharper, more likely to cut whoever tries to hold it. For a long time, I tried to write a ballad about it. Not the details. I kept my promise there, but the shape of the thing. A last wish that does not grant riches or victory, but simply refuses to let two damaged souls continue pretending they are untouched by each other. The song never quite found its melody. Every time I thought I had it, some new argument, some new reconciliation, some new distance between them, changed the tune. Perhaps that is the point. Some stories resist conclusion. They are not neat arcs, but long, looping lines that never quite close. Audiences dislike that. They want endings, moral lessons, a final chord that allows them to clap and go home satisfied. To tell them that the most powerful magic in this tale produced not a happily ever after, but an enduring question feels, to many, like a cheat. And yet, as the years pass, it is that question which haunts me more than any tidy resolution could. On quiet nights, when the hall has emptied and only the embers listen, I think of a witcher and a sorceress bound by words I never heard, walking through a world that keeps demanding they pay for that moment in new and unexpected currencies. We craft wishes all the time, even without djinn, in promises whispered in the dark, in vows spoken before altars, in casual phrases like always and never tossed into conversation, as if they did not have edges. Most of them go unanswered, or answered in ways so ordinary we never notice. But we still wonder whether, if any power were listening as closely as the djinn did that night, we would truly dare to have our deepest, most secret wishes granted, or whether, like Geralt, we would discover that the real miracle is not the fulfillment, but learning to live with what the words we chose have quietly bound us to become. There is a particular drawer in my life that I rarely open. Not a real one, carved of wood, though I have owned a few of those and filled them with mismatched socks and unpaid bills. This drawer is made of paper and hesitation. It lives wherever I travel, bound up in a leather folder that has seen too many roads. Inside are pages not many, and all of them wrong. They are the fragments of the ballad of Geralt of Rivia that I have never managed to finish. I began it after we had parted for a time. Separation is fertile soil for foolish projects. I had returned to Oxenfurt, where the air smells of ink, cheap beer, and ambition. The students there welcomed me like a returning comet, promising free drinks and eager audiences if I would only tell them again what it was like out there, beyond their tidy avenues of thought. They wanted to hear about monsters, of course, about cursed princesses and haunted castles, about the night sky over places that do not yet appear on maps. They wanted the world to be larger than their classrooms, but still safely contained within my verses. That is the secret bargain between bard and listener. I will show you the wilds, but only through a window you can close when the song ends. So I sat in a room above a noisy tavern, the kind of place where the floor holds more stories than the patrons, and I tried to write the definitive song. Not just another adventure, and not a scene snatched from a single contract, but the ballad that would explain Geralt, his beginnings, his choices, the thread that ran through all the seemingly disconnected episodes of his life. I started, as seemed natural, with the Striga in Wizim, a cursed child saved from the crypt, a king wrestling with guilt, a witcher standing between past sin and future possibility. It was easy to make that sound grand. The rhymes came willingly: night and light, curse and reverse, blood and bud. The students would have loved it. But even as the lines took shape, I could hear Geralt's dry voice in my head, pointing out all I had left out. The smell of the crypt, the exhaustion, the doubt, the knowledge that breaking a curse does not erase what happened under its shadow. My verses gave the king more nobility than he possessed, and the court more gratitude than it ever expressed. I was not writing what was. I was writing what would sit comfortably in a hall far away from the stone floor where it had all taken place. Unsatisfied, I turned the page and began again, this time with Blaviken. A marketplace at dawn, a witcher choosing the lesser evil and paying with his name. Butcher of Blaviken fits neatly at the end of a line. The consonants bite. I played with the rhythm of it, imagining a chorus that would make taverns sway. Yet as I worked, I felt again the weight of that title when it falls from lips that never saw the bodies in the square, only heard about them over ale. How could I ask an audience to sing along with that, to clap in time to a melody built on grief they did not share? If I softened it, turned the dead into faceless foes, I would be lying. If I kept it sharp, I would be asking them to rejoice in something that still sat heavily on the shoulders of the man I claimed to honor. Another crumpled page joined the first. Perhaps I thought I should begin where the stories truly tangled, at Sintra, with the law of surprise. A queen on a cliff, a cursed knight, a princess whose anger shook stone, a child promised before breath. There is destiny, there is spectacle, there is enough symbolism to choke a poet. I wrote of waves striking rock, of unseen hands weaving futures in the air above a feast. The verses were, if I may say so, excellent, but they did not sound like Geralt. They sounded like prophecy, like something a temple choir might chant while lighting tall, impressive candles. The witcher in them was less a man than a hinge on which history turned. Useful for chroniclers, perhaps, but unrecognizable as the friend who snored beside campfires and argued about the price of onions. The drawer grew heavier. I tried again with Yennefer, thinking perhaps the heart of the song lay in that crackling line between them. The djinn, the shattering inn, the last wish that changed nothing and everything. Lovers torn by fate is a theme so old it practically writes itself. You need only add a few details, a torn dress here, a whispered goodbye there, and the audience will fill the rest with their own fantasies. But that was precisely the problem. Their story refused to sit still long enough for such treatment. They did not meet, love, suffer, and part in a neat arc. They spiraled, collided, spun apart, drew close again, each time revealing something new and uncomfortable. To pretend otherwise would be to turn them into puppets with strings labelled destiny and passion, jerking along a stage they had not chosen. After half a night of scratching and cursing, I had produced a handful of lines that sounded like every other tragic romance ever sung, and nothing like a witcher and a sorceress whose bond had been sealed in words I had never heard. Into the drawer they went. Days became weeks. The students noticed nothing. I still played, still dazzled them with smaller tales. The quarrelsome Sylvan in the fields, Nivellen in his beastly house, the ridiculous nobles who hired Geralt expecting a statue and received instead an inconveniently thoughtful man. Those songs worked. They were compact, sharp, amusing, or moving as required. The ballad remained stubbornly incomplete. One evening, walking along the Oxenfurt walls with a cup of cheap wine, I wondered why I was insisting on it at all. Why this urge to pin Geralt's life to a single melody? Perhaps it was pride. Bards like to imagine we can turn anything into performance. Give us grief, we will rhyme it. Give us injustice, we will find a refrain that fits. But there is another, quieter reason. We fear being forgotten, not ourselves. We have enough tricks for that, but the people who have mattered to us. To write the ballad of Geralt was to carve his outline more deeply into the memory of the world, to guarantee that centuries from now, when the details of kings and wars have blurred out, someone will still hum his name. Yet every time I tried, the man slipped away into the spaces between my verses. The more I attempted to explain him, the more I felt I was flattening him, ironing out precisely the creases that make a person real, the bad jokes, the unheroic doubts, the way he sometimes stayed to argue with villagers about their prejudices long after the monster was dead and the coin paid. One night, frustrated, I spilled all this to a fellow lecturer, a philosopher who specialized in asking questions no one could answer, and being paid handsomely for it. He listened, sipping his wine with infuriating calm, then said, "Perhaps the problem is that you are trying to write about a man as if he were a conclusion, when he is, in fact, a question." I threatened to push him off the wall for being helpful in such an insufferable way, but his words lodged under my ribs. A question. Not who is Geralt of Rivia, in the sense of listing his contracts and scars, but what does it mean that someone like him exists in our world at all? The next time I opened the drawer, I did not try to begin with a grand scene. I wrote instead of small things, of him refusing extra coin when the job proved easier than expected, of the way he spoke to frightened children as if they were rational beings, of his silence after certain battles when no song could coax him into speech. The result was not a ballad. It was a series of glimpses held together by my own bewildered affection. It lacked a triumphant chorus, a single moral. No hall would commission it as their official heroic anthem. But for the first time, I felt I was inching closer to something honest. I have not performed those pages. They still live in the drawer, travelling with me from inn to inn like a stubborn ghost. Perhaps one day I will weave them into a tale fit for human ears. Or perhaps they will remain what they are. My private attempt to answer for myself why the world feels different for having held a man who kills monsters but spends so much of his life wondering who the real beasts are. We expect songs to give us closure, to wrap lives in tidy endings and teachable conclusions. Yet some of the truest stories I know refuse that kindness. They leave us with an open cord ringing into the dark, and we still wonder whether it is better to force them into resolutions that comfort us, or to let them stand as they are, unfinished, uneasy, and therefore perhaps closer to the way we actually live, stumbling between verses, never entirely sure what the refrain of our own lives will turn out to be. If you stay long enough in one place, you begin to measure time by arrivals. Which caravans came in spring, which lovers returned in autumn, which peddler's bell you hear just before the first snow. If you travel with a witcher, you measure time by departures instead. Not the grand ones with trumpets and banners, but the small, almost invisible leave-takings that happen at dawn, before most people are ready to open their eyes. I have watched Geralt leave more inns than I can name. They blur together if you look at them too quickly. A narrow bed, a crooked window, frost on the inside of the glass, or flies tapping against it, depending on the season. Yet each morning has its own weight, its own small ceremony of preparation that over the years has come to feel like the truest refrain of his life. It begins with quiet. Even the most chaotic inn has an hour when the fire is only embers, and the only sounds are the soft snores of those who managed to find beds, and the heavier rumble of those who fell asleep wherever they happened to drop. In that grey space between night and day, Geralt wakes as if some invisible hand has turned him toward the future. No trumpet, no alarm. His body simply decides that it is time to move again. He does not stretch dramatically or yawn like a man who has the luxury of being surprised by morning. He sits up, tests the air with that faint, habitual frown as if expecting trouble to have grown in the corner while he slept, and then begins the ritual of getting ready. Boots first. They go on with the unhurried efficiency of someone who understands that haste leads to chafed heels, and chafed heels lead to bad footing, and bad footing leads to the sort of poetic death bards later call tragic, because avoidable is less pretty in verse. Then belts, straps, the comfortable weight of the swords settled where his hands expect them. He checks each buckle as carefully as any priest arranging altar cloths. Sometimes he thinks I am asleep while he does all this. Sometimes I am. Other times I lie still and watch through slitted eyes, unwilling to disturb the pattern. There is a tenderness, almost, in the way he moves around the room, careful not to wake whoever shares it with him, whether that be a bard, a stray child, or a dog that has appointed him its temporary god. He knows how costly rest can be. He will not steal it from others lightly. When everything is in place, he pauses. That is the moment I have come to recognize as the true departure. Not the step through the door, but the brief stillness beforehand. In it, there is always a choice, however small. Stay another hour, ask for one more cup of something hot. Wait to see if the day might, this once, pass without his intervention. In all the years I've known him, he has rarely taken that option. The world beyond the door is full of contracts not yet signed, paths not yet walked, dangers that will not politely postpone themselves. He belongs to that world more than to any room that tries to contain him. So the pause ends, and he stands. Sometimes he leaves without a word, trusting that I will find his absence as easily as his presence. Other mornings, when the road ahead is long or uncertain, he nudges my shoulder. Dandelion. Up. It is the least romantic wake-up line imaginable, and yet I have often heard it as a kind of blessing. To be summoned into another day by someone who has already decided to face it is no small comfort. There are, of course, departures where I do not go with him. Those stay with me in a different way. On such mornings, he looks at me a little longer before turning toward the door, as if trying to fix me in place in his memory. I always make some grand, airy remark about meeting again in this town or that, as if rearranging the future with my words could make it so. Try not to die, I usually add. Try not to sing about me too much, he usually replies. We both fail in our own ways. From the window, if I drag myself there, I sometimes catch a last glimpse, a white head moving down the street, a dark outline against the growing light, Roach's familiar shape beneath him. People are rarely awake to see it. The butcher, the baker, the innkeeper's wife. They will encounter him later in the day when he returns with news of a monster dead or a danger averted. Or they will hear only the story of what he did from someone else. They will not see the solitary figure riding out with only his own thoughts for company. There is a difference between hearing that a witcher came and seeing the moment he left. The first belongs to legend. The second belongs to the quiet arithmetic of a life. Every departure is a small gamble that there will be another return, another room, another morning. He makes that wager over and over, not because he enjoys the risk, but because his way of being in the world offers no alternative that he can live with. Once, in a town so small its main feature was a persistent smell of cabbage, I asked him whether he ever grew tired of it. Not the fighting that is another question, and a larger one, but the leaving. the constant repetition of beginnings and endings that never quite become either. He considered as he does before answering. "People like having someone to send," he said at last. "They like knowing there is a person who will ride out while they stay. As long as there is work, there will be someone doing it." "That is not an answer," I protested. "I asked if you are tired." He looked away toward the open countryside, where the road cut a thin line through fields, waiting for rain. "Sometimes," he said, "but it's harder to stay. I have thought a great deal about that remark. To stay, for him, would mean more than remaining in one town. It would mean admitting that the world can turn without his constant wary attention. It would mean trusting others to step into the spaces where monsters flourish and people's fear curdles into cruelty. For a man who has built his sense of self around the idea of being the one who goes when others cannot or will not, that kind of staying might feel like a betrayal. Yet there is another side to it. The more he leaves, the more stories accumulate in his absence. In each town there is an inn where people point to a chair and say, "The Witcher sat there." In each village there is a corner where they whisper, "He stood there when he agreed to help." The man himself becomes a series of impressions left on other lives, like footprints that vanish when the next rain comes but are, for a moment, proof that someone passed this way. That, perhaps, is why I stay when I can, even as my own feet itch for the road. Someone must remember the mornings as well as the evenings, the quiet tightening of straps, the careful closing of doors, the way a man checks his blades not because he craves blood, but because he has seen too much of it spilled for foolish reasons. In the end, every life is a pattern of departures and returns. Most people's circles are small, from home to work, from field to hearth. Geralt's circle is wide and ragged, looping through places that barely appear in other people's thoughts. Yet the shape is the same. Leave, act, come back, rest, leave again. What changes is the weight of what he carries between those points. When I tell stories in inns where he once slept, I sometimes glance at the door mid-song, half expecting to see him there, framed in the light, as if he had simply stepped outside for a moment and now returns to find me decorating his memory. He rarely does, of course. The world is too large, and our separate errands too many. But the possibility hangs in the air like a held breath. And we still wonder whether the truest measure of a life like his lies in the monsters slain and destinies tangled, or in those unremarkable dawns when a tired man stands up, fastens his coat, and chooses once more to walk out into a world that will never quite know what it owes him. There is a certain comfort in being the one who stands to the side. History, as written by kings and chroniclers, rarely blames the man with the loot. If a treaty fails, they point to the signature at the bottom, not to the musician who provided a pleasant backdrop while it was being signed. If a monster kills too many before being stopped, no one demands to know why the bard did not rush forward with a sonnet and a soup spoon. For a long time I hid inside that comfort. It is easier to be the echo than the shout, easier to describe courage than to practice it. I could travel with Geralt, watch him make choices balanced on the edge of disaster, and tell myself that my role was merely to remember, to wrap the harshness of what he did in words that would let other people face it without flinching. But the older I grew, the less convincing that excuse became. Once in a noisy tavern, where the rafters shook when patrons stomped in time to the music, a young man cornered me after a performance. He smelled of fresh sweat and new leather, the scent of someone who has not yet failed badly enough to acquire caution. His eyes burned. "Your songs about witches," he said. "They are why I left home. I'm going to Kaer Morhen. I'll be like him, like the White Wolf. I have been given many compliments. That one chilled me. I looked at his hands soft still, unscarred. I thought of the training he imagined, of the reality he would meet if he survived long enough to complete it. I thought of Geralt's hollow silences after certain contracts, the way he sometimes stared at his own hands as if surprised they were still attached to him. "What is it you want?" I asked carefully. "To kill monsters, or to be a man in a song?" He blinked, not expecting the question. "Is there a difference?" he said. "There is. But explaining that difference to someone who has built his idea of a life around your words is like trying to dissect a melody while the music is still playing in his head." He left before I found an answer that felt both honest and kind. I still wonder where he ended up and what parts of my songs clung to him when the world began to scrape off his illusions. That encounter forced me to confront something I had always known but preferred not to examine too closely. Witnesses are not neutral. By choosing which moments to describe, which to soften, and which to sharpen, I am not merely observing Geralt's life. I am helping decide what he will mean to people who never meet him. When I call him Witcher in verse, the word carries centuries of suspicion and half-remembered tales. When I call him White Wolf, I am adding another layer of symbolism he never asked for. When I sing of his victories but gloss over his doubts, I make it easier for the world to demand more from him than any one man should have to give. Standing beside him, I have seen how heavy those demands can be. Villagers who expect him to risk his life for a handful of coins and a muttered thanks. Town officials who treat him as an embarrassment to be ushered away once the problem is solved. Sorcerers and kings who use him as a piece on their boards, assuming he will move exactly as they predict, because that is what heroes in stories do. And in the background, some fool with a lute measinging of him in ways that sometimes reinforce exactly those expectations. There were nights, after particularly grim days, when Geralt would sit with his back against a wall and listen to me play. I could tell by the set of his shoulders whether he wanted distraction or a mirror. Sometimes he needed laughter, something absurd to remind him that the world still contained foolishness as well as pain. Sometimes he needed a song that acknowledged the cost of what he had done. On those nights, I would sing more carefully. I would include the hesitation before he accepted a contract, the way he had questioned the villagers about their own part in the mess. I would resist, as best I could, the urge to turn his choices into clean victories. The song would land heavier. People would clap more slowly. A few would look uncomfortable, but afterwards he would nod once, the smallest of acknowledgments, and I would know I had, for a moment, told the truth. Truth, however, is a slippery word. My truth about Geralt is not his, nor yours, nor the truth that will be written in dry ink by some future scholar who never smelled Kikimora blood. I see him from the side, at an angle shaped by my own vanity, my fears, my fondness. I am not an impartial witness. I am a man who owes him his life more times than I care to count. Gratitude bends perception as surely as hatred does. So what does it mean to be a witness on the sidelines, as I once proudly described myself to an incredulous sorceress? It means carrying the weight of stories you did not live, but were close enough to feel. It means knowing that your voice can make a man into a legend or reduce him to a footnote, and that both are betrayals of the messy, complicated creature who actually walked beside you. It also means, perhaps, taking on a small portion of his burden. No, I do not swing a sword. My wrists are better suited to strings than steel. But I can, in my limited way, fight monsters of another kind. The comfortable lies people tell themselves about heroism, about war, about those they hire to do what they cannot look at directly. I can make them laugh, yes, but I can also make them pause, think, feel uneasy where before they were certain. There is a risk in that. Crowds do not always welcome the suggestion that their favorite tales leave out important shadows. Tavern owners prefer songs that encourage drinking, not introspection. Princes like verses that confirm their rightness, not ones that question the shape of their victories. To be a witness who admits the cracks in the story is to accept that you may not always be warmly received. I have been booed once or twice. I have seen faces close like shutters when I mention that the empty lands their grandfathers conquered were not empty. I have been asked politely, with coin and compliments, to adjust the ending of a song so that no one important looks foolish. Sometimes I have agreed. I am not as brave as I would like to be. Survival requires compromise, even for those of us whose only weapon is a well-tuned voice. But the older I become, the more stubborn one part of me grows. The part that sat in a temple watching a witcher bleed. The part that walked on the edge of the world and heard elves speak of orchards cut down. The part that saw a queen's feast torn apart by destiny's blunt hand. That part whispers, when I pick up the lute, that I owe more than entertainment to the people whose lives I trade in for applause. I owe them at least the attempt not to turn their pain into something pretty at the expense of its meaning. So here, near the end of this long telling, I find myself asking what my task truly is. Am I preserving Geralt or using him? Am I honouring the witcher I knew, or polishing a statue that will one day bear his name but none of his doubts? I do not have a neat answer. I suspect I never will. But I have come to believe that being on the sidelines does not absolve me of responsibility. It gives me a different kind of it. I cannot slay the monsters he faces, but I can try to keep the world from forgetting that they were real, that their defeat cost something, and that the man who walked away from those battles did not do so untouched. And we still wonder, we watchers and wordsmiths, whether our attempts to capture such lives in stories do more to lighten their burden or add to it, whether, by turning a man into a legend, we are giving him a kind of immortality, or merely ensuring that future generations will know the myth and never quite see the tired figure who slipped out of so many inns at dawn, quietly choosing again and again to go where the rest of us were grateful not to follow. And so I find myself back where I began. A room, a table, a lute, and a night that has grown old while I was busy chasing it with words. The inn is almost silent now. the last drunk has been guided to bed or to the nearest patch of floor. The fire has collapsed into a red-eyed slumber, and even the mice in the walls seem to be listening rather than scurrying. It is a good hour to admit what I do not know. I do not know where Geralt is tonight. There are rumours, of course. There are always rumours about men like him. Some say he rode north, toward kingdoms whose names change every few years as borders shuffle and flags learn new colours. Others swear he was seen on a ship, watching the sea with that narrowed gaze he reserves for things that might decide to bite. I have heard tell of him travelling with a girl whose hair looks like someone tried to weave winter into a braid, and whose eyes reflect far too much of the world for her age. Rumours are easy to adorn. I could add details, have him stride through burning cities, stand on hills where armies clash, trade prophecies with kings and sorcerers. Perhaps he does all that. Perhaps he spends his days arguing with innkeepers about the price of oats while the world insists on making him a symbol. I cannot be everywhere, and so, for once, I must accept that my song cannot reach the full length of his road. What I do know lives in smaller spaces. The way he turned his head when a child called his name. The sound of his voice when he said enough in a tone that stopped cruelty mid-motion. The slow, careful way he cleaned his blades, as if acknowledging that every stain had belonged to something that once believed it had as much right to draw breath as he did. I know the shape of his absence, too. It sits in the empty chair across from me, in the way I still glance at doors, half expecting him to appear when trouble walks in. The world feels slightly tilted without the possibility of his dry remark at any moment, without that steady presence at my shoulder when I am about to make some brilliant, fatal mistake. You might ask why, after all these years and all these tales, I chose to speak so long and so plainly about him now. You have heard the ballads. You did not need this quieter, less flattering account that shows the frayed threads beneath the embroidery. Perhaps it is because I am growing older, and older men become sentimental about truth. Not the grand, capital-letter truth that philosophers sell in thick volumes, but the smaller kind, the one that says, "This is how it felt," even if the chronicles will say otherwise. The chronicles, you see, will have an easier task. They will count contracts fulfilled, monsters slain, treaties influenced. They will list the dates of battles and the names of kings who thought employing a witcher would make them seem decisive. They may mention the law of surprise and the child whose fate tilted like a coin in the air above a banquet table. They will call these things history. But they will not record the smell of herbs in a temple where a witcher fought for his breath. They will not note the precise colour of the dawn that crept in through cracks in an inn's shutters, while he laced his boots for yet another thankless road. They will not remember how his hand sometimes shook, just a little, when he lit a fire on a night after too much blood. And so I have tried, in my clumsy, affectionate way, to set those things down, where at least one person too, now that you have heard them, will carry them forward. What then have we learned, you and I, from wandering through these memories? That monsters are sometimes less monstrous than the men who pay to have them killed. That kings fear humiliation more than failure. That destiny can be invoked with a careless phrase and then blamed when our choices lead where we did not want to go. that love, even when braided with magic and mistake, does not make broken people whole. It simply gives their fractures new patterns. We have seen a cursed princess who was both victim and danger, a town that called its saviour butcher, elves pressed to the ragged edge of a world that no longer draws them on its maps. We have watched a sorceress reach for power and find, alongside it, a bond she would never have freely chosen. We have stood, in imagination at least, in halls where queens measure honour against necessity, and in fields where peasants measure courage against hunger. Through it all, there has been one thin line, a witcher who tries, with varying success, to step where the harm will be least. Not where the glory is greatest, not where the songs will be sweetest, but where, if he must live with himself afterwards, he can do so without collapsing under the weight of his own compromises. He does not always choose well. No one does. He misjudges. He arrives too late or leaves too soon. He saves one person and, in doing so, condemns another to loneliness or anger. There are no perfect decisions on the roads he walks, only less disastrous ones. If that disappoints you, if you had hoped for a cleaner hero, stainless and certain, then perhaps all I can say is this: look around, in your own life, in the lives of those you know. How often is the right path marked with shining stones? More often, I suspect, it is a muddy track between two swamps, and you discover only later which one bred the worse mosquitoes. The tales in The Last Wish tempt us to believe in turning points, in the night in Wizim when a curse is broken, in the morning in Blaviken when a lesser evil is chosen, in the feast at Sintra when destiny drops into a room full of people who thought they were attending nothing more dangerous than a political gathering. They whisper that everything changes in those moments, yet what stays with me after all of it are not only the turning points, but the days in between. The long walks, the quiet meals, the arguments beside small fires about whether the world is worth the effort it demands. In those spaces, Geralt is neither legend nor symbol. He is only a man, tired and stubborn, trying to behave decently in a world that does not reward decency with much more than a slightly easier sleep. Perhaps that is why his story matters. Not because he is unique, though he is, infuriatingly so, but because he makes visible something that exists in many more ordinary lives. The constant grinding task of choosing again and again, not to look away from what is wrong simply because it would be easier to do so. You might never fight a kikimora in a swamp or argue with a queen about the price of blood, but you will, in your own quieter ways, face choices where the lines blur and the lesser evil is all you have. You will meet people others call monsters and discover, to your discomfort, that their eyes look very much like yours. You will be offered stories about nations, about neighbours, about yourself that invite you to stop thinking. If anything in this long night's telling has value beyond my own need to speak, I hope it is this, a small resistance to that invitation, a reminder that names like monster and saviour, destiny and accident are tools we use, not verdicts handed down from some impartial height. They can be taken up, examined, reshaped. Somewhere out there, Geralt of Rivia is still walking, or fighting, or perhaps, for once, resting. Somewhere, too, a child promised by surprise is growing into her own story, one that may make ours look like a prologue. There will be new songs, new witnesses, new mistakes. The world will continue to teeter on the thin edge between what it fears and what it hopes to be. Here, in this small room, we have stepped aside from all that for a while. We have let the noise of politics and prophecy fall away, to listen to the quieter beat of a single, stubborn heart. Mine, as it remembers. Yours, as you listen. His, wherever he is. The candle is nearly done. The ink dries. The road waits outside, as it always does. Before we part, let me offer not an answer, but a question to tuck under your pillow. When you hear, tomorrow or 10 years from now, a tale of someone called to do the hard thing while others stayed behind, whether that someone carries swords or stethoscopes, or nothing but an inconvenient conscience, will you think of them as a legend to admire from afar, or as a person whose quiet departures at dawn cost more than any song can fully repay? I will blow out this light now. Let the darkness come gentler for you than it often did for him. And if, as you drift towards sleep, a white-haired figure passes through your thoughts, do not hold him there as a statue of unbroken heroism. Let him be what he was, flawed, burdened, capable of tenderness as well as violence, forever asking himself whether he had done enough or too much, or the wrong thing entirely. And then, softly, keep wondering with me about the same question he never quite stopped asking, what it truly means, in this tangled, imperfect world, to be even a little bit better than the monsters we fear.